Since man first stepped foot on the moon in 1969, we've always contemplated the possibilities for mankind and space exploration. And while we admire our heroes, Neil Armstrong and Gordon Cooper, to name a few, there are others that conquered space before them. Ancient astronauts, 6000 BC. Impossible? We have the evidence. So join me on Let's Talk Paranormal. Next. My guest today, Jason Martell, is a renowned researcher of ancient astronauts and the Sumerian culture. He's given many lectures on the subject, as well as television and radio appearances. And I'm honored that he's back in the studio with us today. Jason, welcome back with us.
Hi, Tracy. Thanks for having me on.
Oh, you're welcome. You know, the last time you came here was December 2002. Can you believe it?
Yes.
What's been happening with your research since then?
Well, what I've been doing is still trying to continue the expedition of acquiring ancient artifacts, and some of these, as we're going to discuss tonight, shed a new light into the idea of human history, and some of the ideas from a biblical perspective shed a new light when we bring these artifacts and try and analyze scientifically where we really come from, with a religious aspect as well. And have you been touring the world giving lectures, or have you got up-and-coming events? I do have some up-and-coming events. I'll be in the Netherlands in the end of March, and I'll be in San Francisco discussing this research. But on a scientific or on a research note, I should say, what I'm trying to do is gain access to some of these museums, for instance, the British Museum, that has a lot of these artifacts not on public display. Right. And so these curators and people who are in charge of these artifacts will sometimes rotate the collection, or you can, through educational or, I said, scientific reasons, come in and analyze and take your own notes and research, if you will. So that's what I'm aiming to do, is get further access to some of these museums and the artifacts firsthand. Excellent. How did you get involved with the whole ancient astronaut? Yes, well, the topic kind of evolved from my first research, which is a topic now in the news, of Mars and what we're doing there. But initially, looking at some of the data that possibly showed there could be artificial structures on Mars, this then led me into all the other megalithic structures all over the world. If there could be a face and pyramids on Mars, we have things like the Giza pyramids in Egypt, the Nazca lines in Peru, Machu Picchu, Tiwanaku. So there's many other megalithic places, even here on Earth, that really started to spark my interest into who built these and where is the oldest culture that we actually have record of. How did these ancient astronauts build their ships? Well, that's a very esoteric question and hard one to ask, because first of all, we would want to say, well, where is their ship? Where is this actual evidence that we've been visited by beings from other planets in the past? So what I have tried to do is show that many of the stories that we have in the Bible or in biblical tales come from a much earlier tale of this Sumerian culture, which is literally the first record we have of civilization on Earth. And they show up where modern-day Iraq is 6,000 years ago. The kicker is they described living among their living gods and gave depictions of these beings in stone walls and wall reliefs and depictions. And they look just like you would call the Christian angel, human-like men with bird-like characteristics, wings, sometimes even with a beak, depicting the fact that they had the power of flight. Not to say that they were actually birdmen, but they were saying that they were among their living gods. That's very bizarre to think of men with beaks and all the rest of it. You know, I know that you're a very big fan of
Zecharia Sitchin.
Yes.
And I was researching some of his work just recently, and he mentioned about a Sumerian cylinder seal that was over 4,500 years old. And it depicts an astronaut on Mars.
Yes.
And also an astronaut on Earth with a spaceship between them.
That's correct. Zecharia Sitchin, just so that we can give the audience some idea, is a linguist, about 82 years old now, and has been studying Semitic languages for about 50 years. The reason why he separates himself from the majority of linguists is that many other scholars, archaeologists, look at the tales from these ancient cultures, the Sumerians, which we're focusing on, and say, well, these stories of their interaction with their living gods, this is mythology. This is something they're making up as a cultural, spiritual, story. Zecharia Sitchin is one of the few scholars who's decided to say, well, everything else that we can prove from the Sumerian culture, which we'll discuss tonight, is scientifically provable. So all this other information about their interaction with their living gods, we now start to take a new look and say, well, everything else we can confirm about what they knew and their knowledge of mathematics and astronomy and science. So what if this thing that we would put in the tale of mythology, what if these are things that actually took place? And so Zecharia Sitchin is one of the few linguists who actually wrote a series of 8 books called the Earth Chronicles, detailing how the works in archaeology and things that we would call mythological tales might actually have scientific relevance.
Now, have you had a chance to speak with our astronauts to see what they think of all of this with ancient astronauts?
Actually, I have not, but that would be an interesting question to pose. I know that one of the scientists / astronauts, Edgar Mitchell, does have some interest and is, I've heard him tangentially talk about some of the ancient peoples in Egypt and their knowledge and how this could be something that does deserve further merit and research. But that is an interesting angle, talk about modern astronauts.
It is. And also, I know that we have a lot of controversy that people even question that we did, in fact, go to the moon or not, because the Van Allen belt, which is so intense with radiation, how could our astronauts actually pass through it, that we didn't actually go to the moon? So how did these ancient astronauts combat that?
Well, the stories, again, that we have are really coming from this one culture, that, at least that I've tried to focus on, this Sumerian culture. And so the depictions and the descriptions they've given us for how as they called it, the living beings that lived among them, their gods, they called it Anunnaki. And these beings, the Anunnaki, there are several depictions that show, as you mentioned, like what would be interpreted as a spacecraft, or what they called a Shem, which was a Sumerian word for, in English, basically a rocket ship, how the Anunnaki would use this craft that would come down to Earth, and then a smaller shuttlecraft, or a Shem, would depart and then actually land, leaving their mothership still orbiting around Earth. So this is some pretty interesting information, again, coming from a culture that's literally right out of the Stone Age 6,000 years ago. So we really have to start to look at what they're saying with a new eye on the evidence, to say all the things that we now today have with space travel and our own astronauts going into space, many of the things that the ancient peoples tell us, specifically the Sumerian culture, is it really mythology? Were they just making these stories up? Or could they actually have been visited by beings that came from the heaven to earth?
Right. And that's what Anunnaki means, right?
That's correct. The definition for the Sumerian god, Anunnaki, in English just means those who from heaven come to earth.
Right. And they are still out there somewhere.
They very well could be. And interestingly enough, as some of the research shows, that the Sumerians and their astronomical knowledge were very accurate in depicting the outer planets, and said specifically these gods come from a planet within our solar system. They called this planet Nibiru. So there is modern science actually looking for extrasolar planets or a planet beyond Pluto. So there might be one day in our future that we actually do discover another planet within our solar system. And if we do, matching the Sumerian descriptions, we might have ancestors on that planet.
We have some slides to show our viewers today of some of these ancient astronauts. So we'll take a look at the very first slide.
I think one of the interesting slides actually that we're looking at here is, this is an artifact that's over 4,000 years old, and it's one of the Sumerian gods. There's a front view of this as well, but this one's the more interesting angle. And her name is Ishtar, also known as Inanna. And again, many of the depictions that these beings are depicted as is with wings, or having the power of flight.
Right.
And so when archaeologists first started doing excavations in modern-day Iraq and pulling out these winged beings and these artifacts, archaeologists didn't quite understand what they were looking at, and so as I said, they labeled them birdmen.
Right.
They didn't understand what the Sumerians were trying to tell us.
Right.
So we relook at that information now with a new eye and say, well, if these are people living in clay huts using stone tools, they're not going to say, oh, look, it's a space alien or it's a spaceship. They're going to use terminology based on what they have available to them. It's
now,
a god.
Where would that structure be found? Where did it come?
Those are artifacts that were excavated from one of the ancient cities in Iraq called Ur. So many of the artifacts, as we'll see tonight, are stored in the British Museum. That one, in fact, is stored in the British Museum. Some are also in the Louvre in Paris.
Right.
And there's vast majorities of these artifacts that have been excavated from Iraq, from the very first culture we have record of, that speak of their interaction with living gods.
She looked also as well in the palms of her hands that she was crucified.
I think that was probably just some of the detail in actually making the artifact, but the significance to showing screws, I would say I'm not really sure what that would be, other than a pretty technological achievement for a 4,000-year-old artifact to have that much detail.
Okay, we'll take a look at slide number 2.
So this would be another depiction, a wall relief in Iran, actually, of one of the Sumerian gods coming to Earth. And again, depicting them with wings. Archaeologists first finding these wall reliefs said, oh, they're birdmen. Sumerians are talking about mythological tales of their gods. What if these aren't mythological tales? What if these are events that actually took place? And if you'll notice, this wall relief is again about 3,500 years old. It predates Christianity by at least 2,000 years. So angels in the Bible and all those notions. Here's a Sumerian understanding of, again, the angelic being, or however you want to look at it, with wings, a representation of people coming from heaven to earth, visiting us.
And they were always documented on stone tablets.
That's correct. Another majority of the things the Sumerians did to record information was they had the first written language. They were the ones who invented writing. And the majority of their writing they did on clay tablets, since clay was a very easily accessible commodity in the Iraq region at that time, the fertile Mesopotamian crescent there. So a lot of the things they would use would be these clay tablets, and they would twist and turn this wedge-shaped object called a stylus and make all these characters in the clay, firing that clay in a stove, literally making that word writing in stone. And they were the first ones to have a written language on Earth, over 400 characters in their alphabet.
Isn't that amazing?
And right out of the Stone Age it appears.
Amazing. Let's take a look at the next slide.
So this would just be a depiction of one of the Anunnaki, a general wall relief, and it's interesting to note that some of the detail, you can actually see him holding something in his hand, and even on his wrist it looks like there's a band that even could resemble a watch of some sort, some type of device. So a lot of the things, when we look at the detail that they're trying to show us, it starts to raise a lot of questions.
So this is an ancient astronaut?
That's correct.
Wow. That's amazing because you know, our astronauts, our modern astronauts today are all equipped for space flight.
That's right.
Did they have some kind of
bodysuit? The interesting thing, Tracy, is the fact that, today, let me give you an example. When we landed the Apollo 11 mission on the moon, we really did land. The Apollo 11 symbol is an eagle landing on the moon. And if you remember, the first words uttered by Neil Armstrong are, Houston, the eagle has landed. So if someone were to look at this logo of our Apollo 11 mission 6,000 years from now, would they say we were landing eagles on the moon? No. It's the same symbology the Sumerians are using by saying the Anunnaki with wings had the power of flight.
Right.
Same thing with the Apollo 11 symbol. We had the power of flight.
Right. Okay. And that's what that eagle represents.
That's correct.
Power of flight. Okay. And on to the next one. We've got quite a few slides to show everybody today, so we're trying to
We'll try and make it through all of them.
Through them. Yes. So the Sumerian culture then is the oldest that we do have record of?
That's correct. Now, in ensuing periods, it's been called Mesopotamia, Babylon, but the first culture we have record of was from Sumer, modern-day Iraq, but 6,000 years ago. And the interesting thing from this culture is they've left us a prolific amount of artifacts, cylinder seals, and actual tablets. A cylinder seal, what we're looking at here on the screen, is basically a semi-precious round stone.
Right. And
they would reverse carve this imprint that when you'd roll it over wet clay, it would leave the positive imprint. Scholars today are still baffled as to how they were able to reverse carve on this round stone such esoteric depictions.
So when we talk of cylinder seals, it's not actually a rounded container?
Correct. It's more or less like a stamp.
Right. Okay. Okay. And on to the next one. So what do we have here, Jason?
This is another Sumerian artifact just showing a King Darius speaking to another Sumerian, and symbolically you'll see up above them some type of winged device with a crescent moon. Now this is an actual symbolic reference of the planet Nibiru, where these Anunnaki come from. And you see this relief throughout archaeological finds in Middle Eastern areas of Iran and Iraq, this winged disc, which also carried into the Egyptian cultures the sun god Ra. So it stems from an even earlier understanding, 6,000 years to be precise, of the Sumerians and their depictions of their winged being gods, if you will.
So if we know how old the ancient Sumerian culture is, what about the gods, the Anunnaki?
Yes.
What is their age?
Well, that's a very hard question, and I would say that based on some of the research and translations by Zecharia Sitchin, it looks like the Anunnaki, when they first originally came to Earth, which we would put in the context of roughly around 300,000 years ago, very long time. But in that initial interaction with Earth, it looks like these beings were using some type of rocket-propelled technology. Based on the depictions of the Sumerians have left us, it looks like they had been using rocket fuel of some type, and in ensuing years, their advancement in technology, of course, is much surpassed than ours, maybe somewhere upwards of 1 million years. But it's a very esoteric topic to talk about another race on another planet based on just the artifacts that we have. But the evidence is mounting more and more so to the fact that these beings more than likely do actually exist.
Right. And if the Anunnaki are gods, who created the Anunnaki?
That's a good question. Now, another part of the research that Zecharia Sitchin has done, this linguist of 82 years, has looked into the stories bequeathed by the Anunnaki to the Sumerians, by high priests and scribes who have recorded some of these sacred stories. And it's a very elusive topic, but the only answer I could give is that the Anunnaki do believe in a one creator of life, a force, if you will. So, in a sense, the Anunnaki are basically the gods with the small g. We, in some time, will venture out into space, and it'll be like Star Trek. We'll see some primitive civilization. Will we choose to intervene? I don't know. Will they call us gods? I don't know, but it seems to be a cycle.
And we'll take a look at the next slide then, Jason.
Yes.
What do we have here?
So this would be the infamous flood tablet. Now, one of the more esoteric points of the Sumerian information is how that some of these artifacts, a majority of the artifacts, parallel biblical tales in the Old Testament and in the New King James Version, the New Testament in English, the Bible. So this tablet that we're looking at is actually stored in the British Museum, and it predates the Hebrew or English version for the Noah's Ark story of a great flood.
Interesting.
And it's again stored in the British Museum, and this is written in cuneiform, which is again this primitive, Sumerian culture, predating Christianity and the Hebrew version by thousands of years, yet telling the same parallel story of a Sumerian being chosen by an Anunnaki to build a great ark.
Right. And I believe that there are actual documents supporting the evidence of Noah's Ark.
That's correct.
That our governments have.
Interestingly enough, there was a show on the Discovery Channel recently of how on Mount Ararat, they've done all these, basically the CIA and Department of Defense did actual satellite analysis and imagery of this large object that's protruding from Mount Ararat, where in the biblical tales it says that the ark came to rest. So there's a lot of hoopla, if you will, as to surrounding some of these artifacts, and I think that getting access to analyze data in that region is very hard to do for government reasons, letting you to Mount Ararat to actually analyze the ark, if it is the ark. So it's very hard to get access to that.
Right. And the next slide, so that we can push along.
Yes, just going forward and explaining that some of the depictions that we have, again, for angels in the Bible, when we look at some of these earlier versions, even thousands of years earlier, depictions of angels, what the Sumerians called the Anunnaki, it looks just like, if you will, our modern day angels, with the whole idea of wings or this having a glow about them. An Anunnaki, if you were to be standing in front of you, you'd say he might have somewhat of a glow to him.
Right.
So it's a really interesting parallel that these stories we now have in English of biblical or spiritual beings coming and visiting us have even earlier roots that mesh very well in parallel with some of the biblical tales in English and in the Old Testament.
The Anunnaki, what kind of beings do you think these are? Do you think they are benevolent or malevolent?
Good question.
Beings?
Good question. Well, the Anunnaki, basically, the Sumerians write that the Anunnaki created us in their image and after their likeness. So if you were to ask me, what does an Anunnaki look like? an Anunnaki male or female, I would say, well, we look like them. Because word for word, just as the Bible says, God created us in His image and in His likeness. That's
Right.
the English version. There's also
Right.
a Hebrew version. So this Sumerian story specifically says these Anunnaki created us in their image and after their likeness to basically serve them as their slaves. So it gets into some really interesting topics, but again, we can start to put more of a scientific angle to this information because we have the artifacts, we have the evidence to look at and analyze and make our own decisions.
Of course, they just have the bigger noses, though.
Right.
The poor souls. Big noses. What about the next slide? Oh,
So-
this is interesting.
Yes, and so this is addressing the question that you mentioned as far as giants upon the earth. Many of the artifacts actually show Sumerians seated before an Anunnaki god, and they've depicted him as a much larger being. Now, I don't know if it's an actuality to say that they were physically larger, or if it was just their way of saying they were renowned great men,
Right.
kings, if you will. But a very interesting correlation to there was a time before the flood and after that there were giants upon the earth, it says in the
Right.
Bible. Well, here we have Sumerian artifacts predating these English stories by thousands of years.
Because that was one of the questions I was going to ask you about, the size of these giants. Are we
Yes.
talking of huge beings here?
Yeah, well, I think there are actual differences from the genetic makeup of these Anunnaki that they could actually be from anywhere from 7 to 10 feet.
Right.
6 to 10 feet even. But, again, it's a very hard thing to answer without having a physical being in front of us to
Right,
analyze.
absolutely,
But the
absolutely.
depictions that they've left us clearly show them as renowned, very aesthetically, genetically perfect, if you will, muscular fit, and sometimes depicted much larger.
Right. What about the next slide? And all of these were excavated from where?
The
was
majority,
it?
so far, the ones we've looked at have been excavated in Iraq. Some of the wall
Right.
reliefs are also found in Iran,
Okay.
in some of the cities. But the reason why this takes a turn for an interesting topic is the fact that the Sumerians had very accurate astronomical knowledge and cited all of the planets that we know of in our solar system, aside from saying they cited an additional planet. Now, they didn't say there were 10 planets, like, we think that there's 9. They actually counted our solar system as having 12 members. They counted the 9 planets we know of, the sun making 10, our moon, Earth's moon making 11, and this additional planet, the 12th planet, where the gods came from, these Anunnaki. And this is the Sumerian planet X, was just a representation of saying that even today through our modern science, we are looking for a planet X. X meaning unknown, but also Roman numeral 10, which would in scientific terms today be beyond Pluto. So there's a lot of meshing between the ancient knowledge of this planet and our modern search if a planet beyond Pluto does exist.
Right. And of course, we did our very first show on
That's
Planet
correct.
X. For people who didn't see that show, if Planet X does come by, what can we expect?
Well, I don't think we're going to have a Planet X revisit anytime soon. Current best guesstimates would put it basically the earliest arrival would be 2085. And I say arrival in the sense that we looked at earlier this idea of a flood tablet. The Sumerians very specifically detailed why there was a great flood. They said that this planet passes by Earth on a 3,600-year cyclic event. They call it a shar. They said this is a completed circle. 3,600 years is the orbit of this planet. But they say when it passes Earth, in the past, it has caused gravitational effects to our planet. Great floods, maybe part of the ice shelf could crack off in the Antarctic, significantly raising water levels. So this is the theory that in the past it has caused cataclysmic events, and so the theory is that when it comes by again, we could be in for a wild ride. I just don't think it's going to be coming anytime soon.
Doom and gloom.
Yeah, that's right.
Sounds like doom and gloom. What about the next one?
So this is and I'm sorry it's not as clear, but this is a very interesting tablet that's also stored in the British Museum. And it's a Sumerian astronomical tablet that shows observations of Venus over long periods of time. They recorded astronomical things in the sky very accurately. For instance, one of the tablets, a scribe, whoever was able to read the information contained on this tablet, would be able to tell you 50 years in advance when a lunar eclipse would be able to take place.
Right.
So they had all of this knowledge that we can now test scientifically. Astronomical information, science, mathematics, having the first
That
written
is
language.
incredible.
It really is amazing from the first culture that we have record of.
That is so amazing.
The knowledge, again, that the Sumerians had for astronomical information, it really is becoming overwhelming.
Right.
A lot of the things that they cited our modern science has now been able to confirm with our space telescopes, sighting things, the distance between the outer planets. For instance, the Sumerians actually gave the color of the outer planets. We didn't know what the actual color of the outer planets were until we sent probes like the Voyager and Galileo that took color pictures in the 70s. And interestingly enough, it matched the Sumerian data from thousands of years ago.
Didn't they come back with the data of 2 blue planets, sister planets?
That's correct. The Uranus and Neptune, one of the terms for Neptune, for instance, is Mosh Sieg, which meant like bright greenish.
Right.
And so it was very interesting how close their depictions were. And this is from a culture, again, that's basically roughly 6,000 years old.
That is so incredible. Jason, let me ask you, we had a couple of email questions that I want to ask you
Sure.
today from people who knew you were going to come onto the show.
Yes.
And the first question is from Mike, who says, are these ancient astronauts the same people as Eric von Daniken speaks about in Chariots of the Gods? That's interesting.
Very good question, yes. Well, the only answer I would say is that there's only a handful of scholars, such as Zachariah Sitchin, Eric von Daniken, that are choosing to look at this information that's classified as mythology by Maine Archaeology and say, well, what if this isn't just mythology? What if these are ancient astronauts, beings from other worlds or maybe within our own solar system that actually came and visited us and influenced our ancient peoples? So the research by Eric von Daniken falls into the same lines of thinking for the Anunnaki. I'm just not sure that Eric von Daniken makes that connection to say that these beings were the Anunnaki. But all around the world, any culture, there's these references to beings coming down from the heavens to earth.
Right.
So in my mind, I should say, the best case scientifically for proving ancient astronauts are the Anunnaki. We have physical evidence. We have actual artifacts that show there was a time when man lived among his living gods.
Right. The second email question was from a Renee who asks, I saw you on the previous show and was fascinated with the Anunnaki. When are they returning?
Yes, yes.
We want to know, Jason.
Well, I'm not
So
even
we can
sure,
run to the hills.
I'm not even sure that they've ever left, would
Right,
be the answer.
right.
A lot of the things that are going on today with what we see on TV with the whole topic of UFOs and aliens, is the government hiding things, Area 51. In my opinion, over the last 10 years of doing my research, there seems to be a desensitizing of the public to this whole idea of are we alone? And in my personal belief, I believe that there's something going on just like a galactic federation of planets, like Star Wars, Star Trek, like we already see. I think we're slowly being given a nudge to make these changes for ourselves, stop having wars, stop messing up the planet, and eventually, hopefully within my lifetime, our lifetime, we will get to meet these beings. Because yes, I firmly do believe that they exist and they're still influencing our culture in whatever manner that might be.
Absolutely. Jason, thank you so much for coming
Thank you,
back to
Tracie.
see us. We look forward to having you back again.
Yes.
And everybody, please check out Jason's information here, Ancient Astronauts. It's on his website, xfax.com and ancientx.com. And we'll look forward to seeing everybody next time on Let's Talk Paranormal. Until then, bye-bye.